They say you should never judge a book by its cover. But on Flight 409, out of JFK, senior flight attendant Veronica St. James didn't just judge the book, she tried to burn it. She saw a black man in a hoodie and saw a nuisance. She didn't see the man who had spent the last 20 years rewriting aviation safety laws. She didn't see the badge in his pocket that gave him the power to ground her entire airline. This is the story of how one woman's arrogance led to the most satisfying, career-ending karma in aviation history. You are not going to believe how this ends. The fluorescent lights of JFK International Airport hummed with a frequency that seemed designed to induce migraines. For Morgan Thorne, a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades in airports, the noise was usually white noise. But today, it felt like a drill against his temples. It had been a grueling week in Washington, D.C. The Senate hearings regarding the new commercial safety protocols had run late into the night for 3 days straight. Morgan, recently appointed as the senior inspector for the FAA's Eastern region, was exhausted. He wasn't wearing his usual charcoal-tailored suit. He wasn't wearing his federal lanyard. He was wearing a faded gray Philadelphia Eagles hoodie, loose sweatpants, and a pair of beat-up Nike Monarchs. He looked like a man who had just rolled out of bed, which wasn't far from the truth. He just wanted to get home to Atlanta. He wanted a bourbon, his porch, and silence. He adjusted his backpack, checked the digital display at gate B32, and saw Boarding Group 1 flashing in bold amber letters. Morgan looked down at his ticket. Seat 2A, first class, a perk of the job, but also a necessity given his frame. At 6'4", economy seating was physically painful. He joined the priority lane, which was currently empty save for a businessman in a trench coat who had just scanned through. Morgan stepped up to the podium. Standing behind the computer terminal was Veronica St. James. Veronica was a fixture at Stratum Airlines. With her platinum blonde hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful, and a uniform that was pressed to military precision, she was the lead purser for the flight. She was also, according to the whispers of junior staff, a tyrant. She didn't just check tickets. She guarded the jet bridge like it was the entrance to an exclusive nightclub. As Morgan approached, he held out his phone with the QR code displayed. Veronica didn't look at the phone. She didn't even look him in the eye. Her gaze dropped instantly to his sneakers, then scrolled up to his hoodie, landing on his face with a look of practiced disdain. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. "The general boarding announcement hasn't been made yet. We are currently only boarding first class and Diamond Medallion members." Morgan blinked, his eyes stinging from lack of sleep. "I know. I'm in Group 1. Veronica let out a short, sharp sigh, the kind a mother gives a toddler who refuses to eat their peas. She finally looked him in the eye, tilting her head. "Sir, please listen. Group 1 is for our premium passengers. Economy boarding, Groups 4 through 9, will begin in approximately 20 minutes. Please step aside so you don't block the lane for priority customers." Morgan felt the familiar heat rise in his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, and sadly, he knew it wouldn't be the last. But he was too tired for a lecture. He just wanted to sit down. "I understand how the groups work," Morgan said, his voice deep and steady. "If you scan the pass, you'll see I'm in 2A. He thrust the phone forward again. Veronica didn't scan it. Instead, she stepped back from the podium, crossing her arms over her chest. The line behind Morgan was beginning to grow. A young couple stood behind him, looking awkward. Behind them, an older man in a suit checked his watch impatiently. "Sir," Veronica said, louder this time. She was performing now. She wanted the audience. "I am not going to ask you again. You are causing a scene. You need to step back to the general waiting area, or I will have security escort you away from the gate." "You're refusing to scan my ticket?" Morgan asked, his voice dropping an octave. It was the voice he used when a frantic airline CEO tried to explain away a maintenance violation. It was the voice of authority. "I am refusing to let you hold up my boarding process," Veronica snapped. She looked past him to the older man in the suit. "I apologize for the delay, sir. Some people just don't understand protocol." The man in the suit huffed. "Unbelievable. Come on, buddy, move it." Morgan looked at Veronica. He memorized the name on her silver wing pin. St. James. He looked at the man behind him. He took a deep breath. He could pull the badge now. He could slap the leather wallet onto the counter, flash the gold shield, and watch the color drain from her face. It would be easy. But Morgan Thorne was a methodical man. He liked to see how deep the rot went before he cut it out. If she was this brazen at the gate, what was she like at 30,000 feet? As an FAA inspector, his job wasn't just to enforce rules, it was to identify systemic failures. Veronica St. James was a systemic failure. "Fine," Morgan said softly. "I'll wait." He stepped out of the line. Veronica smirked, a victorious curl of red lipstick. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said, managing to make the word cooperation sound like submission. She turned to the man in the suit with a dazzling fake smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Henderson. Right this way." Morgan leaned against a pillar nearby, watching. He waited until every single passenger in groups 1, 2, and 3 had boarded. He waited until the Group 4 announcement was made. Only then did he approach the other agent, a younger woman named Sarah, who looked terrified of Veronica. Veronica was busy rearranging luggage tags, ignoring him. Morgan handed his phone to Sarah. Sarah scanned it. The machine beeped a pleasant green tone. She looked at the screen, then at Morgan, then back at the screen. Her eyes went wide. "Mr. Thorne," she stammered. You're in first class. You should have boarded 20 minutes ago." "I tried," Morgan said loud enough for Veronica to hear. "Your colleague thought I looked like I belonged in the back." Veronica froze. She turned slowly. She saw the screen. 2A. Priority. Paid full fare. For a second, just a second, fear flickered in her eyes. But then, the arrogance returned. She couldn't be wrong. Not publicly. "Well," Veronica sniffed, smoothing her skirt, "if you had dressed appropriately for the cabin you purchased, perhaps there wouldn't have been any confusion. We try to maintain a certain standard on Stratum." Morgan took his boarding pass from Sarah. "Standards," he repeated. "We'll see about that." He walked down the jet bridge, his heart rate steady, his mind sharpening. The investigation had begun. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was a magnificent machine, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was poisonous. Morgan ducked his head as he entered the aircraft, turning left toward the first-class cabin. He found 2A. It was a window seat, a wide leather recliner with ample legroom. He tossed his backpack into the overhead bin and sat down, closing his eyes for a moment. "Excuse me." Morgan opened his eyes. Veronica was standing over him. She wasn't holding a pre-flight champagne or a hot towel. She was holding a manifest, and she looked annoyed. "Is there a problem?" Morgan asked. "I need to see your boarding pass again," she demanded. Morgan reached into his pocket and pulled out the paper slip Sarah had printed for him. He handed it to her. She stared at it, frowning. She tapped her pen against her chin. "This is very strange." "What is?" "The system is showing a double booking for seat 2A, she'd lied. Morgan knew she was lying. He knew the software Stratum Airlines used. He had audited it 3 months ago. Double bookings in first class were flagged immediately at the gate, not after boarding. "I'm the only one sitting here," Morgan said calmly. "Yes, but we have a platinum key member," Mr. Sterling, who is supposed to be in this seat. And since he is a frequent flyer and you are, well, since there is a discrepancy, I'm going to have to ask you to move." "Move where?" "I have a seat available in 24C. It's an aisle seat," she said, as if she were offering him a gift. 24C is economy," Morgan said. "I paid for first class." "And you will be refunded the difference," Veronica said dismissively. "Now please, grab your bag. Mr. Sterling is boarding any minute now, and I need this seat cleared." "I'm not moving," Morgan said. He buckled his seatbelt. The click was loud in the quiet cabin. The other first-class passengers were watching now. A woman across the aisle, wearing expensive jewelry, looked uncomfortable. A man in 1B was pretending to read his iPad, but was clearly listening. Veronica's face flushed pink. "Sir, you are failing to comply with crew member instructions. That is a federal offense. Do I need to call the captain?" "Please do," Morgan said. "I'd love to speak to Captain." He glanced at the flight deck door. "Captain Miller, I believe that's who is flying the 787s out of JFK today." Veronica narrowed her eyes. "You don't know who the captain is?" "Call him," Morgan challenged. Veronica glared at him for a long, tense moment. She realized she couldn't drag him out physically, and calling the captain for a seat dispute over a double booking that didn't exist might expose her lie. She needed a different angle. She let out a huff. "Fine. If you want to be difficult, stay there. But don't expect the service you clearly didn't pay for." She spun on her heel and stormed into the galley. Morgan watched her go. He took out his phone and made a note in his secure app. Time, 4:05. Incident, denied boarding attempted based on appearance. Incident, attempted involuntary downgrade without cause. Incident, threat of federal intervention without basis. 10 minutes later, boarding was complete. The doors were sealed. There was no Mr. Sterling. The seat remained his. As the plane taxied to the runway, Veronica began the safety demonstration. Her voice was professional over the PA system, but her eyes were cold steel whenever they swept past row 2. Once they reached cruising altitude, the service began. Veronica moved through the first-class cabin with a beverage cart. "Champagne, Mrs. Vanderbilt." "Certainly, Veronica. Thank you." "Scotch on the rocks, Mr. Henderson." "You remembered." "Thanks, doll." She reached row 2. Morgan had his tray table down. "Water, please," Morgan said. "No ice." Veronica pushed the cart past him, locking the wheels at row 3. She leaned back. "I'm sorry, sir. We're out of bottled water. I can get you tap water from the lavatory if you're desperate." Morgan looked at the cart. He could see 3 large bottles of Evian sitting right there on the top shelf. "The Evian right there," Morgan pointed. "Those are reserved for our Diamond members," Veronica lied smoothly. "As I said, I have tap water." "I'm a paying first-class passenger," Morgan said. "The amenities are included in the ticket." "And I'm the lead purser," she hissed, leaning in close so only he could hear. "And on this plane, I decide who gets what. You might have scammed your way into that seat, but you don't belong here. So you sit there, you keep your mouth shut, and you enjoy the ride, or I will have the authorities waiting for you in Atlanta." She straightened up, put on her fake smile, and turned to the passenger behind him. "Mr. Davids, a gin and tonic, wasn't it?" Morgan sat back. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He slowly reached into his backpack and pulled out a small black notebook. He opened it to a fresh page. He wasn't writing a diary entry. He was writing a citation. But things were about to get much worse. As the plane began its crossing over the Appalachian Mountains, the fasten seatbelt sign flickered on. The plane jolted, a violent, shuddering drop that made the passengers gasp. This wasn't normal turbulence. Morgan felt the vibration through the floor. It was a rhythmic shudder. Thump, thump, thump. He knew that feeling. He knew that sound. It was a hydraulic instability in the starboard landing gear assembly. Morgan unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Sit down!" Veronica shouted from the galley. "The seatbelt sign is on." "You have a mechanical issue," Morgan said, his voice projecting clearly through the cabin. "You need to tell the captain to check the starboard hydraulic pressure. Now." "Sit down, or I am restraining you," Veronica screamed, grabbing a plastic flex cuff from the emergency kit. She had been waiting for this. An excuse. "I'm serious," Morgan said, stepping into the aisle. "I need to talk to the pilot. This isn't turbulence." "That is it!" Veronica lunged forward. "You are hijacking this flight!" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Passengers screamed. The man in 1B tackled Morgan from the side, pinning him against the bulkhead. "I got him!" the passenger yelled. "I got the terrorist!" Morgan didn't fight back. He let them pin him. He let Veronica snap the plastic cuffs around his wrists, biting into his skin. "You are going to jail for a long, long time," Veronica whispered into his ear, her voice trembling with adrenaline and glee. Morgan looked at her, his face pressed against the cabin wall. "We'll see," he whispered back. Morgan sat in the forward jump seat, his wrists zip-tied so tightly that his hands were beginning to go numb. He was facing the first-class cabin, a prisoner on display. The man who had tackled him, Mr. Henderson from 1B, was back in his seat, sipping a freshly poured scotch, accepting grateful nods from the other passengers as if he had just disarmed a bomb. Veronica stood over Morgan, her chest heaving with the thrill of the situation. She picked up the cabin interphone and dialed the flight deck. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "We have a situation. I've restrained a passenger in first class. He made threats. He claimed to know about a mechanical failure and tried to storm the cockpit." Morgan listened, his jaw set. Storm the cockpit? He had taken one step into the aisle. He could hear the muffled, crackling response of Captain Miller on the other end. "Copy that, Veronica. Is the cabin secure?" "Yes, Captain. He's flex-cuffed in the jump seat. I have 2 passengers keeping an eye on him." "Good. We're getting some strange readings up here. Probably sensor errors. But I don't need a distraction right now. We're going to continue to Atlanta. Keep him quiet. We'll have law enforcement meet us at the gate." "Understood." "St. James out." She hung up the phone and looked down at Morgan with a sneer that could curdle milk. "You hear that? Law enforcement. You picked the wrong flight, honey." "You need to tell him," Morgan said quietly. His voice was calm, which seemed to infuriate her more. "Tell him the vibration is coming from the starboard hydraulic line. The strange readings aren't sensor errors. If he loses pressure on approach, the gear won't lock. You are putting everyone in danger." "Shut up," Veronica hissed. She grabbed a napkin from the counter and balled it up. "One more word, and I will gag you. I swear to God." Morgan leaned his head back against the bulkhead. He closed his eyes. There was no point in arguing with her. She was too deep in her own narrative. To her, he wasn't a safety inspector. He was a thug who had challenged her authority. She needed him to be a villain so she could be the hero. The plane shuddered again. This time it was violent. The overhead bins rattled and a glass slid off Mr. Henderson's tray table, shattering on the floor. "It's just turbulence," Veronica announced loudly, forcing a smile. "Just a little chopped air, folks. Nothing to worry about." But Morgan knew the rhythm. Thump. Drag. Thump. The hydraulic fluid was leaking. The pressure was dropping. The control surfaces on the right wing would be sluggish. For the next 2 hours, Morgan sat there, cataloguing every violation. Violation. Flight attendant focused on prisoner management rather than cabin safety checks during turbulence. Violation. Flight attendant discarded broken glass in a non-secure bin. Violation. Flight attendant failed to visually inspect the wing despite passenger reports of weird noises. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from triumph to anxiety. The vibration was constant now, a low-frequency buzzing that made your teeth ache. The passengers stopped glaring at Morgan and started looking out the windows. "Veronica," a woman in 3A called out, Is that smoke?" Veronica rolled her eyes and marched over to the window. She peered out. A thin, vaporous trail was streaming from the back of the right engine cowling. It wasn't smoke. It was atomized hydraulic fluid hitting the slipstream. "It's just condensation, Mom," Veronica lied. "Clouds." "At 35,000 feet?" Morgan muttered. Veronica spun around. "I said silence." The chime of the PA system interrupted her. It was the captain. His voice wasn't the soothing baritone of a commercial pilot anymore. It was tight, strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We're going to be initiating our descent into Atlanta a little earlier than scheduled. We have a minor indication light on the dashboard that we want to get checked out. Nothing to be alarmed about, but we will be landing shortly. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival immediately." "Minor indication," Morgan whispered. "He's lost the B-system hydraulics." Veronica looked pale. She knew, deep down, that something was wrong. But she couldn't admit it. Not to him. She aggressively checked seatbelts, snatching cups from passengers with trembling hands. When she passed Morgan, she avoided his gaze. She sat in the jump seat opposite him for the landing. She buckled her harness. Her leg was bouncing nervously. "If we crash," Morgan said softly, "it's because you didn't relay the information." "We aren't going to crash," she snapped, though her voice cracked. "And when we land, you're going to prison." The descent was fast. Too fast. The spoilers on the wings deployed to slow them down, causing the plane to buffet violently. The engine pitch whined high and shrill. "Brace positions!" Veronica yelled, her training finally kicking in over her ego. "Heads down! Stay down!" The wheels slammed onto the tarmac of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The plane bounced, once, twice. Then, a screeching roar filled the cabin. The right wing dipped low. The plane swerved violently to the right, careening off the center line. Screams filled the cabin. Overhead, bins popped open, raining luggage onto the terrified passengers. Morgan watched the horizon tilt through the galley window. The pilot was fighting the rudder, trying to keep them on the concrete. The brakes groaned, a sound like tearing metal. With a final lurching shudder, the plane came to a halt. It was tilted at an awkward angle, the right side significantly lower than the left. Silence. Then, the smell of burnt rubber and hot metal. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's breathless voice came over the speaker. We have stopped. Please remain seated. Emergency vehicles are on their way." Veronica unbuckled her harness. She looked at Morgan. She was shaking, but the mask of arrogance slammed back into place. She had survived. Now she needed a scapegoat for the chaos. "You," she pointed a manicured finger at him. "You distracted the crew. This is your fault." Morgan just looked at her. "Open the door, Veronica. The police are waiting." The jet bridge extended with a mechanical whine, locking onto the fuselage. The door to the 787 didn't open immediately. Through the porthole window, flashing blue and red lights painted the tarmac. Veronica grabbed the PA handset. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Authorities are boarding the aircraft to remove a security threat. Once he is removed, we will deplane." She looked at Morgan with pure vindication. "This is it. I hope you like federal prison food." The heavy door swung open. 3 officers from the Atlanta Police Department stepped onto the plane. Behind them were 2 men in dark suits wearing earpieces, FBI. And behind them was a woman Morgan recognized immediately, Port Authority Director Elaine Jenkins. Veronica straightened her uniform, smoothed her hair, and stepped forward. She put on her most tragic, victimized face. "Officers," she said, her voice trembling theatrically. "Thank God you're here. It's him, the man in the jump seat. He's the one." The lead police officer, a burly sergeant with a shaved head, looked at Veronica, then looked past her to Morgan. He frowned. "He claimed to have a bomb?" the sergeant asked. "He said he was going to take the plane," Veronica embellished, gesturing wildly. "He stood up during the flight, refused to sit down, threatened the captain. He was ranting about the hydraulics to confuse us. Typical distraction tactic. He's dangerous." The FBI agent stepped forward. "Is he armed?" "We don't know," Veronica said. "We restrained him before he could get into his bag." The sergeant walked over to Morgan. Morgan sat quietly, his hand still purple from the tight flex cuffs. He didn't look like a terrorist. He looked like a tired man in a hoodie. "Sir," the sergeant said, hand resting near his holster. "I'm going to need you to remain calm." "I am calm, Sergeant," Morgan said. "I'd like these cuffs off, please. I believe I've lost circulation in my left thumb." "Don't listen to him," Veronica shrieked. "He's manipulating you." The sergeant looked at Morgan closer. He squinted. Then his eyes widened slightly. He looked at the hoodie. He looked at the face. "Wait a minute," the sergeant murmured. He turned to the director, Elaine Jenkins. "Director, is this—" Elaine Jenkins pushed past the FBI agents. She was a formidable woman in a pantsuit that cost more than Veronica's car. She looked at the man in the jump seat. Her jaw dropped. "Morgan?" she gasped. Veronica froze. You know him?" Elaine didn't answer Veronica. She rushed forward, her face pale with horror. "Oh my God, get those cuffs off him, now." "Director, he's a suspect," the FBI agent started. "He's not a suspect, you idiot," Elaine snapped. "That is Morgan Thorne. He's the Regional Director of Flight Standards for the FAA. He's the man who certifies this airport." The silence that fell over the first-class cabin was heavier than the plane itself. Veronica felt her stomach drop through the floor. The blood drained from her face so fast she felt dizzy. "FAA? Regional Director?" The police sergeant scrambled to pull a cutting tool from his belt. He sliced the plastic cuffs. Morgan rubbed his wrists, grimacing. Deep red grooves were etched into his dark skin. Morgan stood up. He towered over the sergeant. He towered over Veronica. He stretched his neck, hearing a satisfying crack. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and flipped it open. The gold badge of the Federal Aviation Administration gleamed under the cabin lights. Below it was his ID card. Morgan Thorne, Senior Inspector, clearance level, top secret. He turned to Veronica. She was trembling. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I didn't... The hoodie. You were in the priority lane." Morgan ignored her. He turned to the FBI agent. "Agent," Morgan said, his voice hard as granite. "I want you to take a statement from this flight attendant. I want her detained for interference with a federal safety official during an in-flight emergency." "Detained?" Veronica squeaked. "Me? But I was protecting the flight." Morgan stepped closer to her. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You ignored a warning about a critical hydraulic failure because you didn't like the way I was dressed," Morgan said, his voice low and dangerous. "You assaulted a federal officer. You falsified a report to the captain. And because of your ego, this plane nearly careened off the runway. You didn't protect this flight, Ms. St. James. You nearly killed everyone on board." He turned to the director. "Elaine, I want the flight logs seized. I want the cockpit voice recorder pulled immediately. And I want Stratum Airlines' chief of operations on the phone. Now." "Done," Elaine said, pulling out her phone. "And her." Morgan pointed at Veronica without looking at her. "Get her off my plane. I have an inspection to finish." The sergeant grabbed Veronica's arm. He wasn't gentle this time. "Let's go, Mum," he said. No, you can't." Veronica looked around wildly for support. She looked at Mr. Henderson, the man who had tackled Morgan. Mr. Henderson was currently shrinking into his seat, pretending to be invisible. "I followed protocol. He looked suspicious. It was a judgment call." "Your judgment," Morgan said, watching her being dragged toward the door, "just cost you your wings." As they hauled a sobbing Veronica up the jet bridge, Morgan turned back to the stunned first-class cabin. The passengers were staring at him, with a mix of awe and terror. Morgan adjusted his hoodie. He looked at the messy galley, the spilled drinks, the terrified junior flight attendant, Sarah, who was cowering in the corner. Morgan softened his expression when he looked at Sarah. "You," Morgan said gently. Me?" Sarah stammered. "You tried to scan my ticket at the gate. You tried to tell her." "Yes, sir, I did." Morgan nodded. "You did good. You're going to be a witness in the investigation. Tell the truth, and you'll be fine." He rolled his shoulders, picked up his backpack, and looked at the cockpit door. "Now," Morgan said, cracking his knuckles, "let's go have a chat with the captain." The cockpit of the Boeing 787 was silent, save for the cooling fans of the avionics stack. Captain Miller sat in the left seat, his hand still gripping the yoke, knuckles white. Beside him, First Officer Stevens was staring at the master warning panel, which was currently lit up like a Christmas tree. The door clicked open. Captain Miller spun around, expecting the police. Instead, he saw the man in the grey hoodie. The man Veronica had said was a terrorist. The man who was now standing in the doorway, filling the frame, holding a gold badge that caught the sunlight streaming through the windshield. "Captain Miller," Morgan said. His voice was dangerously soft. "Do not touch anything. Hands off the controls. Both of you." Miller swallowed hard. Who are you?" "I'm the man who's about to decide if you ever fly a kite again, let alone a wide-body aircraft," Morgan said. He stepped inside, crowding the small space. "Morgan Thorne, FAA Senior Inspector." Miller's eyes widened. He looked at the badge, then back at Morgan's face. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. He had seen Morgan's picture in the industry newsletters. This was the Grim Reaper of the Eastern region. "Mr. Thorne?" Miller stammered. "Sir, we were told there was a security threat. The lead purser is currently in the back of a squad car." Morgan cut him off. "I'm not interested in her right now. I'm interested in you." Morgan squeezed past the jump seat and leaned over the center console. He pointed a long finger at the IACA's display screen. "Right there," Morgan said. "Hydraulic system B pressure. It's reading 0. "Yes, sir," Miller said, sweating. "We lost it on final approach. That's why the landing was rough." "Rough?" Morgan raised an eyebrow. "You drifted 30 feet off the center line. You blew 2 tires. You nearly put this bird in the grass. And you lost pressure on final?" "Yes, sir." Morgan leaned closer. "Don't lie to me, Miller. I was in seat 2A. I felt the pump cavitation at cruising altitude over West Virginia. You had a vibration in the number 2 engine drive pump for 2 hours." Miller looked at Stevens. Stevens looked at his lap. We had some fluctuations," Miller admitted, But we thought it was sensor error. Sensor error, Morgan repeated, tasting the words like sour milk. And when the passenger in 2A, me, sent a message via the flight attendant that the starboard hydraulic line was vibrating, what did you do? Veronica told us you were a hijacker, Miller protested. She said you were trying to storm the cockpit. She said you were making up technical jargon to confuse the crew. So you ignored a specific technical warning about a critical system because it came from a black man in a hoodie? Morgan asked. The silence in the cockpit was deafening. That's not. It wasn't about race, Miller said weakly. It was about security protocol. Protocol, Morgan scoffed. He reached over and tapped the flight management computer. Let's talk about protocol. Did you check the squawk sheet before takeoff? Of course. Morgan pulled his phone out. He opened the FAA database, which was linked directly to Stratum Airlines maintenance servers. Because looking at the logs right here, Morgan scrolled, Flight 409 reported a minor hydraulic seep on the starboard gear 3 days ago in London. Maintenance signed it off as monitor only. They didn't fix it. They just topped off the fluid and sent you on your way. Did you know that? Miller went pale. I saw the note, but maintenance cleared it. And when the vibration started, did you check the fluid quantity indicator? Miller faltered. He didn't, First Officer Stevens spoke up. His voice was small, terrified. Shut up, Stevens, Miller snapped. No, you speak up, son. Morgan turned to the young co-pilot. This is the part where you save your career. Did Captain Miller check the fluid quantity? Stevens looked at his captain, then at Morgan. He saw the badge. He saw the end of his life's dream. No, sir. I pointed out the quantity was dropping near Pittsburgh. I suggested we divert to Charlotte. Captain Miller said we were already behind schedule, and that Veronica, the lead purser, said the guy in first class was just causing trouble. He said we push through to Atlanta. You traitor, Miller hissed. Morgan straightened up. That's all I needed to hear. He tapped his headset. Director Jenkins, you getting this? Loud and clear, Morgan. Elaine Jenkins's voice came through the phone he had left on speaker in his pocket. The CVR will corroborate it. Morgan looked down at Captain Miller. Captain, you are relieved of duty effectively immediately. You will surrender your pilot's license to me right now. You knowingly operated an aircraft with a failing critical system. You ignored a crew warning, and you endangered 200 souls to stay on schedule. Miller's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't undo his belt. You can't do this. I have 30 years. And you just ended them in 30 seconds, Morgan said coldly. Get out of that seat. It's a crime scene now. Miller unbuckled. He stood up, looking small and defeated. He walked out of the cockpit, past the police officers who were waiting for him. Morgan sat in the captain's chair. He looked at Stevens. And you, Morgan said. You're suspended pending investigation. You knew better, and you didn't override him. But because you talked, you might get to fly cargo in Alaska someday. If you're lucky. Stevens nodded, tears in his eyes. Thank you, sir. Morgan sighed. He rubbed his temples. The headache was back. He looked out the cockpit window at the terminal. He could see the Stratum Airlines logo on the jet bridge. One down, Morgan muttered to himself. Now for the head of the snake. The emergency response conference room at Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson was a sterile glass box overlooking the runway. Usually, it was used for weather briefings. Today, it was a slaughterhouse. Morgan sat at the head of the long oak table. He had finally changed. He had retrieved his checked bag, which, miraculously, hadn't been lost, and changed into his official FAA uniform, a crisp white shirt, a dark blue tie, and the navy blazer with the Department of Transportation emblem. He looked every inch the executioner. Opposite him sat the crisis team from Stratum Airlines. There was Charles Whitlock, the Vice President of Operations, a man with a tan so deep it looked painted on. There was their General Counsel, a sharp-featured woman named Linda Graves. And there was the base manager, sweating profusely. They looked at Morgan with a mixture of hostility and fear. They knew who he was now. The hoodie incident was already trending on Twitter. Someone had filmed Veronica being dragged off the plane. The PR nightmare had begun. "Mr. Thorne?" Whitlock started, his voice oily and patronizing. "First, let me offer our sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding with Ms. St. James. She was a rogue employee. We have already terminated her employment. We want you to know that Stratum Airlines does not condone discrimination of any kind." Morgan didn't blink. He had a file folder in front of him. He didn't open it yet. "A rogue employee," Morgan repeated flatly. "That's your story?" "It's the truth," Linda Graves, the lawyer, interjected. "She violated multiple company policies. We are fully cooperating with the authorities regarding her conduct. We are prepared to offer you a substantial settlement for the distress caused, and of course, a lifetime diamond medallion status." Morgan laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Diamond medallion? You think I want to fly on this airline ever again?" "We understand your anger," Whitlock said, leaning forward. "But let's not blow this out of proportion. It was one bad apple. The flight landed safely. No one was hurt." "No one was hurt?" Morgan opened the file folder. "Let's talk about why no one was hurt. No one was hurt because the landing gear held on by a thread. Literally." He slid a photo across the table. It was a close-up of the starboard landing gear strut, taken by the ground crew 10 minutes ago. The metal was sheared, black with heat stress. If that pilot had touched down with 3 more knots of side load, that gear would have collapsed, Morgan said. The wing would have hit the runway. The fuel tanks would have ruptured. You would have had a fireball on runway 27 right. Whitlock looked at the photo. He loosened his tie. "Mechanical failures happen, Mr. Thorne. It's aviation." "Negligence happens, Mr. Whitlock," Morgan corrected. "I pulled the maintenance logs for the entire fleet of 787s. The room went dead silent. You pulled the fleet logs?" Graves asked, her voice losing its confident edge. "You need a warrant for that." "I am the senior inspector for the Eastern region," Morgan said calmly. "I don't need a warrant. I have authority under Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And you know what I found?" He pulled out a stack of papers. "Deferred maintenance," Morgan read. "Aircraft 704, hydraulic leak, deferred. Aircraft 709, flap asymmetry sensor, deferred. Aircraft 882, weather radar intermittent, deferred." He threw the papers onto the table. They scattered like leaves. "You have a culture of defer and fly," Morgan said, his voice rising. "You push your pilots to ignore warnings. You push your mechanics to patch things with duct tape and prayers. And you push your flight attendants, like Ms. St. James, to prioritize image and speed over safety." "That is speculation," Graves snapped. "Is it?" Morgan pulled out a printed email. "This is a memo sent by you, Mr. Whitlock, 2 weeks ago. Subject, turnaround times. Quote, do not let minor cabin disputes or non-critical sensor warnings delay pushback. Time is money." Whitlock's tan seemed to fade. "Where did you get that?" "I have friends in low places," Morgan said. "Mechanics who are tired of being bullied. Pilots who are scared to fly your planes." Morgan stood up. He walked over to the window and looked out at the Stratum Airlines planes parked at the terminal. Ms. St. James treated me like a criminal because she saw a black man in a hoodie and assumed I was a threat, Morgan said, his back to them. She profiled me, but she felt comfortable doing that because you created an environment where rules don't matter, where authority is based on a uniform, not competence. He turned around. Here is what is going to happen, Morgan said. I am issuing an emergency order of revocation. Revocation? Whitlock stood up, knocking his chair over. You can't do that. You'll bankrupt us. I am grounding your entire 787 fleet effective immediately, Morgan said. Every single one. They don't move until every hydraulic system is inspected, repaired, and signed off by an FAA inspector of my choosing. This is insane, Graves yelled. Do you know how much money we lose a day if you ground the Dreamliners? I don't care about your money, Morgan said, cold as ice. I care that when my mother, or my neighbor, or a stranger gets on a plane, they get off alive. He picked up his phone. I've already sent the order to air traffic control. Your planes are grounded, Mr. Whitlock. Your stock price is going to tank in about... He checked his watch. 10 minutes, when the press release goes out. You can't do this, Whitlock screamed, his face purple. Who do you think you are? Morgan smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had worn all day. I'm the guy from seat 2A, Morgan said. The one you should have treated with respect. He walked to the door. Oh, and regarding Ms. St. James? Morgan paused, hand on the doorknob. She's facing federal charges for interfering with a crew member, but I'm also recommending the Department of Justice look into Stratum Airlines for systemic safety fraud. You might want to save that substantial settlement money for your criminal defense lawyers. He walked out, leaving the executives of Stratum Airlines in a room that suddenly felt very small and very cold. But the story wasn't over. The karma had hit the airline, but the personal reckoning for Veronica, the woman who started it all, was just beginning. 3 months had passed since Flight 409 nearly careened off the runway at Hartsfield-Jackson. The aviation world had been turned upside down. Stratum Airlines was currently rebranding after their stock value plummeted 40% following the indefinite grounding of their 780s fleet. The Thorne Report, as it was now called in the media, had exposed a decade of cut corners and safety violations. But for Veronica St. James, the geopolitical shifts of the airline industry were background noise to the implosion of her own life. The setting was the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. The room was mahogany and cold marble. It smelled of floor wax and old paper. Veronica sat at the defendant's table. Gone was the tailored Stratum uniform. Gone was the platinum bun and the red lipstick. She wore a frumpy, off-the-rack blouse and slacks. Her roots were showing. She looked 10 years older. She looked small. She was facing 2 counts: interference with flight crew members and attendants, 49 U.S.C., paragraph 46504, and false statements to a federal agency. Morgan Thorne sat in the front row of the gallery. He didn't have to be there. His deposition was already on file, but he wanted to see this through. He wore his charcoal suit today, the gold badge clipped discreetly to his belt. The prosecutor, a sharp-witted woman named Attorney General Vance, was wrapping up her closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Vance said, pacing in front of the box, "the defense wants you to believe that Ms. St. James made a simple mistake, a customer service error. They want you to believe that her refusal to listen to Mr. Thorne was just a personality clash." Vance stopped and pointed at the large screen in the courtroom. A still image from a passenger's cell phone video was frozen there. It showed Veronica screaming at Morgan, holding the flex cuffs, her face twisted in a mask of superiority. But the evidence tells a different story, Vance continued. This wasn't customer service. This was a power trip that endangered 212 lives. Ms. St. James was told, explicitly, that there was a mechanical failure. She was told by an expert, and because that expert did not look like the platinum member she was used to serving, she decided to silence him. Vance leaned on the railing. She chose her ego over your safety. She treated a federal inspector like a criminal, and in doing so, she delayed the cockpit's response to a critical emergency. If the landing had occurred 2 minutes later, we wouldn't be here for a trial. We would be here for a memorial service. Veronica put her head in her hands. She was weeping softly. It wasn't the dignified cry of a martyr. It was the terrified sob of someone realizing the walls were closing in. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood up. We find the defendant, Veronica St. James, guilty on all counts. The judge, the Honorable William H. Sterling, ironically sharing the name of the phantom passenger Veronica had tried to use against Morgan, looked down at her over his spectacles. "Miss St. James, please stand." Veronica stood, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the table. "In my 20 years on the bench," Judge Sterling said, his voice booming, "I have seen bank robbers, fraudsters, and violent criminals, but rarely have I seen such staggering arrogance. You held a position of trust. You were the safety officer in that cabin, and you weaponized that trust." I'm sorry," Veronica whispered. I thought I was doing my job." "You were doing a job," the judge corrected. "Just not the one you were paid for. You were playing gatekeeper, and because of that, you are grounded. Permanently." The gavel raised. "I sentence you to 18 months in a federal correctional facility, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Furthermore, you are placed on the federal no-fly list for a period of 10 years. You will not work in the aviation industry again." Bang! The sound of the gavel was louder than the landing gear collapsing. As the bailiffs moved in to cuff her, real steel cuffs this time, not the plastic ones she had used on Morgan, Veronica looked back at the gallery, her eyes locked with Morgan. There was no anger in Morgan's eyes anymore, just a profound, heavy pity. "Mr. Thorne," Veronica cried out as the bailiffs took her arms. "Mr. Thorne, please, tell them. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." Morgan stood up slowly. The courtroom went quiet. He didn't shout. He spoke in that same deep, calm voice he had used on the plane. "That's the problem, Veronica," Morgan said. "You shouldn't have needed to know who I was to treat me like a human being." She sobbed as she was led out the side door, the heavy oak swallowing her cries. 6 months later. Morgan sat on his back porch in Atlanta. The sun was setting, painting the Georgia sky in hues of bruised purple and gold. A glass of aged bourbon sat on the table next to him. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, the junior flight attendant from Flight 409. MSG from Sarah. "Just wanted to let you know. I got promoted today. Lead purser on the New York route, and we just delayed pushback because a passenger in 34F heard a weird noise. Mechanic found a loose valve. We caught it. Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Morgan smiled. He took a sip of the bourbon. The heat of the liquor warmed his chest. The industry was changing. It was slow and it was painful, but it was changing. Stratum Airlines had fired their entire executive board. New protocols were in place. "Listen to the passenger," was the new mantra. He thought about the hoodie. It was still in his closet, washed and folded. He probably wouldn't wear it to the airport again. He preferred the suit these days. But he kept it as a reminder. A reminder that authority doesn't come from a uniform. It doesn't come from a title. It comes from competence, integrity, and the willingness to speak truth to power, even when you're handcuffed in a jump seat. He looked up as a plane traced a white contrail across the darkening sky. It was a Stratum Airlines jet, banking safely toward the west. "Fly safe," Morgan whispered to the empty air. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence. It was the best sound in the world. And that is the story of how one man in a hoodie took down an entire corrupt airline and the arrogant flight attendant who tried to stop him. It's a brutal reminder that you never know who you're talking to. The person you judge today might be the person holding your fate in their hands tomorrow. Veronica St. James learned that lesson the hard way, behind bars. But Morgan Thorne proved that true power isn't about being loud, it's about being right. What would you have done if you were in Morgan's seat? Would you have stayed calm, or would you have lost it? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of high-altitude justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about karma hitting back hard, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a video. Fly safe, everyone, and remember, respect costs nothing, but arrogance can cost you everything. See you in the next one.